The morning sun had barely cleared the ridge when Sarah first noticed the cowboy watching her from across the meadow, and she felt something stir in her chest that she hadn't felt in years, and it wasn't fear exactly, but it wasn't comfort either, and she pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders even though the September air was already warm. She had come to Montana to escape, and everyone back in Denver knew it, though nobody said it out loud, and her daughter Emily had driven her to the airport with that worried look in her eyes, and Sarah had promised she would be fine, and she would call every Sunday without fail. And maybe she would be, and maybe she wouldn't, but she needed to try. The ranch belonged to her cousin Margaret, who had married a cattle rancher 30 years ago and never looked back, and Margaret had said, "Come stay as long as you need, and there's plenty of room and plenty of quiet." And Sarah had packed 2 suitcases and left behind a marriage of 32 years and a house full of memories that had turned sour. The cowboy's name was Frank, and she learned this later that first morning when Margaret introduced them at breakfast, and he was probably 65 or so with silver hair under his hat and eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled, and he said, "Ma'am," with such genuine respect that Sarah felt tears prick her eyes for reasons she couldn't explain. Margaret poured coffee and said, "Frank runs the place, really, and he's been here since. My Robert passed and I don't know what I'd do without him," and Frank ducked his head like he was embarrassed and said, "Now, Maggie, I'm just doing what needs doing," and Sarah watched this exchange and felt like she was seeing something precious and rare. That first week, Sarah mostly kept to herself, and she would walk in the mornings when the dew was still on the grass, and the horses would come to the fence and breathe their warm breath on her hands, and she would stand there feeling their gentleness and wondering why she had forgotten that gentleness could exist. She saw Frank working every day, and he moved with a quiet efficiency that spoke of decades of practice, and sometimes she would watch him from the porch as he mended a fence, or worked with a young horse, and there was something in his patience that made her chest ache. One afternoon she found a bird with a broken wing near the barn, and she didn't know what to do, and she was standing there feeling helpless when Frank appeared beside her, and he knelt down slow like his knees weren't what they used to be, and he looked at the bird for a long moment, that hand, and he said it so quietly, she almost didn't hear, and gently, "Please." And he was talking to the bird, not to her, and he cupped his weathered hands around the small creature with such tenderness that Sarah had to look away, because something inside her was breaking. He carried the bird to a box lined with soft hay, and he said sometimes they make it, and sometimes they don't, and all we can do is give them a chance and be gentle while we do it. And Sarah nodded because she couldn't speak, and he didn't seem to expect her to. The days passed in a rhythm that was new to her, and she helped Margaret with small tasks around the house, and she learned to make biscuits the way Robert had liked them, and Margaret would tell stories about the early years, and about learning to love this hard, beautiful land. Frank ate dinner with them most evenings, and he didn't talk much, but when he did, his words carried weight, and one night Margaret asked Sarah about Denver, and Sarah found herself talking, and the words came tumbling out about her husband Richard, and how the man she had married had slowly disappeared over the years. She told them about the criticism that had started small and grown, and about how she had shrunk herself trying to be what he wanted, and about how one day she had looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the woman staring back, and her voice cracked when she said, "I just couldn't anymore." Margaret reached across the table and squeezed her hand, and Frank sat quiet for a moment, and then he said, "My wife passed 12 years ago, and toward the end she told me that the best thing I ever did was treat her gentle, and I think about that a lot, and how being gentle costs nothing, but means everything." Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, and it was like a door opening after being locked for years, and she realized she couldn't remember the last time Richard had touched her with gentleness, and maybe that was the thing she had been grieving all along. The next morning, Frank asked if she wanted to help move some horses to the upper pasture, and she said yes, without thinking, and he saddled a gentle mare named Daisy, and he showed Sarah how to sit and how to hold the reins, and his hands were steady and sure when he helped her mount. They rode slow through the golden meadow, and the mountains rose up around them, and Sarah felt small, but not in the way Richard had made her feel small. And this was different, and this was being part of something vast and beautiful. And she understood why Margaret had never left. Frank rode beside her easy in his saddle, and he pointed out an eagle soaring overhead, and he showed her where the deer came down to drink in the evenings. And he told her about the land, and about the seasons, and about how winter here could be harsh. But spring always came eventually, when they stopped to rest the horses by a stream. Sarah said thank you, and Frank looked at her with those kind eyes and said for what? And she said for being patient with me and for not making me feel foolish. And he smiled and said, "Ma'am, there's no foolishness in learning something new at any age." They sat on smooth rocks by the water, and Frank told her about growing up on a ranch in Wyoming, and about his marriage to Helen, and how they had never been able to have children, but had loved each other fierce and true, and how her death had nearly broken him. He said, "Margaret saved me really and gave me purpose again, and gave me this place and this work, and some people might think it's just cows and horses and fences, but it's more than that, and it's about taking care of things and being gentle with the world and with yourself." Sarah felt tears on her cheeks, and she didn't brush them away, and Frank didn't pretend not to notice, and he just sat there solid and present. And after a while, he said, "You're going to be all right, and I don't know when, but I know you will," and Sarah believed him. The weeks turned into a month, and Sarah talked to Emily every Sunday, and her daughter kept asking when she was coming home, and Sarah kept saying, "Soon, and maybe I don't know." And finally Emily said, "Mom, you sound different," and Sarah said, "I think I'm remembering who I used to be." Margaret taught her to can tomatoes and make preserves, and they worked side by side in the kitchen, and Margaret said, "You know you can stay as long as you want, and this can be home if you need it to be." And Sarah felt gratitude wash over her like warm water. She started helping Frank with the evening feeding, and he would talk to the horses in that same gentle voice he had used with the bird. And he taught her their names and their personalities, and which ones needed extra patience and which ones were still learning to trust. One evening, as they were closing up the barn, a storm rolled in fast, and the wind picked up and rain started falling in sheets, and they ran for the house laughing like children. And when they burst through the door, soaked and breathless, Margaret took one look at them and smiled. Sarah caught sight of herself in the hall mirror, and she was wind-blown and rain-soaked, and her face was flushed and her eyes were bright, and she looked alive in a way she hadn't looked in years, and something inside her recognized this person and welcomed her home. That night, after Margaret went to bed, Sarah and Frank sat on the covered porch and listened to the rain, and he told her about the first time he had seen Helen, and how she had been wearing a yellow dress at a county fair, and how his heart had just known. She asked him how he had stayed gentle after losing her, and he was quiet for a long time, and finally he said, "I think grief can make you hard, or it can make you soft. And I chose soft, and I chose to keep my heart open even though it hurt. And maybe especially because it hurt." Sarah told him about the moment she had decided to leave, and how Richard had said something cruel about her appearance, and how something inside her had just snapped, and she had walked out of the room and started packing, and she had left. The next day, Frank said, "Good for you," and there was such conviction in his voice that Sarah felt validated in a way she hadn't allowed herself to feel, and he said, "Life's too short to spend it with someone who makes you feel small, and you deserve gentleness, and you deserve respect." The rain had stopped, and the air smelled clean and fresh, and somewhere in the distance a coyote howled, and Sarah felt a strange peace settle over her, and she realized she hadn't felt anxious in days, and she hadn't checked her phone compulsively, and she hadn't worried about saying the wrong thing. Frank stood to go, and he paused at the steps, and he turned back and said, "Sarah," and it was the first time he had used her first name, "and you're stronger than you know, and you're going to find your way, and I'm glad you came here." And Sarah said, "I'm glad too." October came with golden aspens and crisp mornings, and Sarah started riding Daisy on her own, and she would go out early before the ranch woke up, and she would watch the sunrise paint the mountains, and she would breathe in the cold air and feel grateful. She called Emily and told her she wasn't coming back to Denver, and not yet anyway, and maybe not ever. And Emily was quiet, and then she said, "Mom, I'm proud of you." And Sarah cried because those were words she had needed to hear. Margaret threw a small dinner party for Sarah's birthday and invited a few neighbors, and Frank wore a clean shirt, and Sarah wore a